Hello, everyone is Bringonthechaos Glizzy for another What If Beerus is an Olympian god of destruction? Beerus has a second chance in life. The former G.O.D is stuck in a world full of gods. Titans? Other being inhabits it. What will the former G.O.D do in this dimension? Finding love or going to the path of destruction?
The Olympian god of destruction. Chapter 8. The Titanomachy. Atop Mount Othrys. Lord Kronos, sir, Atlas began, kneeling before the leader of the Titans, as he sat upon his throne in his personal throne room. The Titan Lord's wound left behind by Beerus had closed up a while ago, as had
his tunic, making it appear as though he'd never been genuinely hurt in the slightest. His face itself was like stone, showing no outward emotion. It was his eyes, however, as Atlas gazed up at the universe's ruler, that made it blatantly clear what his true emotions were at the current juncture. His dark brown eyes set into a cold, vicious glare that spoke volumes about how livid he truly was at present. Report. Kronos's gravelly voice spoke, uttering just a single word as he leaned over his throne, his hands gripping against the magically enforced armrests of what had once been his own father's seat he'd used while overseeing the entire world. His tone sounding so icy and chilling even to Atlas, his own ally, that it felt like time itself had frozen over then and there, despite Kronos having not yet willed it so. Atlas simply nodded and got to it, not wanting his leader in his current mood to feel like he was wasting his time. The damage left to the fortress by the new god who we've now come to know as Beerus. My son. Kronos cut him off briefly. Those two words alone filled with nothing but barely contained venom, as his eyes narrowed like slits. The air, no, the very space and time, around him rippling and distorting with his bubbling contempt and rage. Your son. The broadly built Titan acknowledged, to his credit, without so much as even the tiniest stutter, seeing how much just mentioning the purple-haired deity got under the king's divine skin. The damage he dealt to our fortress has been fixed up for a start, though I must report, it took longer than it should have. Yes, Kronos hissed, nursing his midsection where his bastard child had bust out, freeing himself and the rest of his damn spawn in the process. I'd already caught onto that when it took far longer than it should have for the hole he punched in my gut to heal up. Atlas's features only winced minorly at being given such a reminder, recalling himself how his lord's son had embarrassed him too. Yes, well, while we're on that, my lord, it would seem that word of what occurred earlier has traveled throughout Mount Othrys. Hardly surprising, seeing as my bastard son chose to smash his way out of our domain and damage the mountain itself. Kronos would have been shocked if there was even one being, whether in this domain or close by, that hadn't either felt, heard or saw a section of the castle and the massive mountain shattering and falling down to the earth below. Something like that is impossible to miss, and I wouldn't doubt those nymphs that ran off also spilled the beans on such an embarrassment. You're not wrong on that. I spoke with Hyperion before I arrived here, and it seems as though his wife Thea, and most likely the other titanesses that dwell here, have been made acutely aware of what happened. Won't be much longer now for it to travel beyond this domain, what with all the ruckus the news is causing, if it's not in the process of doing so already. Have you spoken to Rhea since, my king? Kronos's eyes narrowed as his expression darkened, and Atlas immediately got the sense that something had gone wrong. No, but if her lack of presence in my castle, and anywhere near Mount Othrys, is anything to go by, I'm sure she's well aware as well. Wait, the queen is gone? Atlas asked, seeing the calculating, and if he could be frank, downright paranoid look that his leader's eyes held on the subject of Rhea. Yes. And given the convenience of her absence coming on the same day that an escape of our children took place, a part of me suspects she knew something like this would occur. How so, my lord? Not that I doubt your word, but. Atlas. Kronos cut off his second in command, leveling him with a cold, pondering stare. Tell me, do you recall the amount of my kin that came out of me earlier? The amount. Atlas blinked in confusion, not sure where his leader was going with this. Still, he knew better than to question his ruler's train of thought and gave that a quick moment to ponder before replying. If I recall, there was about 6 of them, including that bastard Beerus. Why do you ask? I didn't pay much mind to it at the time, on account of all the drama that my son caused for us, but looking back now, I've come to realize that of all the children of mine that came out when that unruly son of mine punched my stomach open, there was one that was suspiciously absent from the lot. The 7th and most recent child Rhea bore for me was nowhere to be seen in the group of my spawn that escaped me. Atlas remained silent, as he ruminated on the implications of such a thing being the case. He of course had been told of the cursed prophecy that his grandfather Uranos had handed down to Kronos by his own father a while back, and also knew this to be the reason why he got rid of any children he sired with Rhea. If one had been missing, as his king had said, that could only mean. I see you're realizing the true issue at hand there. Kronos noted, seeing the dawning look of comprehension on the muscle-bound Titan's features. It would appear that whatever Rhea handed me the day our latest child was born, it certainly wasn't the newborn. His eyes flashed with anger at that. And adding to that, do you recall the gift that so-called son of my eldest brother, the one called Zeus, supposedly handed up on his behalf as an apology? Atlas nodded slowly. The potion. What about it? Kronos chuckled darkly, though there wasn't even a shred of humor in his voice. Would you believe that a small bit of it still remained on my hand even after I crushed it? The Titan Lord raised a hand near his face and turned his gaze towards it, almost boring a hole through it as though it had been part of an awful joke. Funny thing was, now that it was touching my skin, I could sense the magic that was put into it. HMPH. To think, that cheeky little shit had the gall to call it a taste enhancer. Atlas didn't even have to ask to know just by the sound of Kronos' tone that what Zeus had told him was a lie. Kronos continued, only this time with the very space around them beginning to ripple and bend with his growing fury. If he hadn't chosen that moment to blast my gut open, and I'd been foolish enough to put this in my drink, that taste enhancer would have had me puking and retching my guts out. Atlas's eyes widened slightly. But wouldn't that mean? Yes, Atlas. In other words, it would seem as though my spawn were destined to come out of me today one way or another. Oh, the convenience of it all. One child missing from the group that got out of his innards, and then some young god who he'd never seen before shows up with a daughter of Oceanus, claiming to be his son, on the very day that his wife coincidentally leaves without a word, and gives him a potion potent enough to have him puke out his offspring, had his purple-haired progeny not somehow made his way out the hard way. It would appear I allowed myself to be conned by you, Rhea. I should have been paying more attention that day you handed me whatever was wrapped in that blanket. Not that it would have mattered, seeing as his eldest son would have punctured a hole in him regardless, but it was the intent that counted. I should have known you wouldn't let what I was doing go, and even more so that how you've been recently, showering me with all that affection and sex, it was all just an act, wasn't it? Despite my caution, I grew too complacent around you, it seems. That would be something he'd have to rectify eventually, preferably when he dealt with his escaped children first. Zeus included, it seemed, and Beerus especially. Seated on what was once his father's throne, he not only could cast his gaze from the heavens down to the infinite expanse of the world below, but could also feel more than ever the way the sky itself rumbled at him following Beerus's vow and his children's escape. It would seem that Uranos, even in his formless state, was laughing at him right now. No doubt enjoying seeing every second of his predicament, with his curse on him bearing fruit and relishing in what he saw as karma finally being served to the son who'd felled him all those years ago. Just as he'd foretold. Despite his best attempts, he felt the inkling of fear in the back of his head, that no matter what he did, he was doomed to fall at this point. Doomed to be overthrown by his eldest son and the rest of his children, the very thing he tried so hard to avoid. Such a thought, as it had done before, brought terror clenching at his very being. All before he crushed that feeling with impunity. Damn it all, there wasn't a chance in Tartarus he was going to allow his damned father's accursed prophecy to come true. There wasn't a doubt in his mind that his blasted father's curse was referring to his eldest son now. Not after the way he'd made an impact like that at his expense before his Titan brethren. He'd be sure to deal with him personally, and then cast the rest of his scions into the deepest, darkest pit of Tartarus. Right beside his revolting brothers, the Cyclopes and Hecatonchires. Afterwards, he'd deal with his treacherous wife last. Summoning his scythe to his side, and gripping it harshly in his hand, Kronos' eyes glowed a mixture of red and gold as everything around him warped. The very fabric of reality seeming to become unwound all around where he sat, just from the sliver of power he released. His next words coming out in a controlled, but commanding tone, as every word seemed to cause distortions and boom through the tides of time itself. Atlas, be sure our brethren are prepared, for this slight shall not go unchallenged. My son Beerus, in his arrogance, vowed to not only destroy me, but have you all groveling at his feet like dogs. I will not allow that to happen. Nor will I, or our fellow Titans, my lord. The muscle-bound Titan spoke up with conviction. His own eyes beginning to glow a pale, milky white as his leader continued. We are at your command, my lord. Naturally, because if it's my destruction he seeks, then that foolhardy son of mine has as good as declared war on us all. And if it's a war he wants, Kronos rose from his throne, his entire form beginning to glow the same reddish golden aura his eyes did, as he slammed the butt of his trusted weapon upon the floor, creating a tremor that was felt across all of Mount Othries and beyond. Then it's a war he'll get. Back on the Isle of Crete, the very next day. Beerus let out a contented yawn as he rose off his bed in the early morning still dressed in his tunic. A feeling of heightened gratification bubbling through him as he stood up and stretched his arms out within his room before scratching the back of his head with a pleased smile on his face. His room, despite having no light source within, managing to remain visible and reasonably well lit seemingly without any form of logic behind it. Now that was something I needed. Short as it was, that had to be one of the best naps I've ever had, the former G.O.D of Universe 7 thought pleasantly, not even feeling an ounce of the grumpiness he'd have felt after slumbering back in his old universe, as he made his way towards the doorway in front of his bed that had a weirdly glowing yellowish field that surrounded the empty space where a door would have normally gone. Following after their reunion, where their mother had had plenty of time to catch up with them after recovering from the surprise of what he'd told her, she'd decided to make the cave, their temporary form of residence, a good deal more hospitable. She'd done this by creating individual rooms for each and every one of them, including herself, within the vast mountain cave, with the exception of Zeus and Metis, who'd shared theirs, to act as their bedchambers. Each one having a bed of course that had been formed from the ground, and then imbued with but the tiniest sliver of her divine magic to form a comfy mattress atop them for each of her children to rest on, with even some pillows to go along with them. This, of course, was mostly for the benefit of her children that had been stuck inside of their so-called father's stomach up to now, as although none of them actually required sleep, Rhea wanted them to get some proper rest for the days ahead. After having to stew in their father's acidic fluids for pretty much their entire lives up to now, she'd saw it as the least she could do to start making it up to them for allowing what she'd referred to as her precious babies to deal with such a revolting existence for that long, even if none of them, not even Beerus himself at that point, put any of the blame on her for that. The cave rooms, and by extension now the rest of the cave, also becoming decently lit up compared to before, with a unique, almost homely feel, due to Rhea's influence. The walls of the cave were also especially thick with divine magic coursing through them, and according to Rhea, this meant that any sounds coming from within any of the rooms would not travel out. Something about in case they felt they needed to vent or something but didn't want to disturb the others, they could just do it in their rooms. Additionally, while the doorways held no actual doors, the intriguing yellowish field that covered it entirely made it impossible to see inside or out of the room depending on where you were, unless you went through it. Naturally, Beerus had more than appreciated the gesture, especially when he'd first laid himself down on his own bed last night and felt the stark difference between floating in disgusting stomach fluids all this time, to now laying on what had to be the plushest and comfiest bed he'd ever been on. He wasn't exaggerating on that either. Even the best pillows combined with his own personal bed that had been made with the finest materials from Universe 7 back in the day weren't as cozy as the one Rhea managed to gift him with the greatest of ease. Beerus was a rather simple god at heart, who took great pleasure in the simpler things in life, like good, delicious food and a nice place to take a nap. Despite his loss of any cat-like features, that didn't mean he'd lost his liking for things he'd loved prior to his rebirth, and suffice to say, his new mother's first official act to start making up for lost time and their unsavory entrapment, was well appreciated by him. Enough so to where the woman was already in his good books. That being said, there was also the case of his other family member he'd been recently introduced to. His youngest brother, Zeus. Leaving aside what had occurred yesterday in that castle, Zeus had shown to him after they got here that he was smart enough to avoid stepping on Beerus's toes. Additionally, Rhea had chosen upon seeing his hesitance to get him more involved with the rest of them, due to not wanting to leave any of her children out of what she saw as much needed bonding time. If Beerus was being honest, given his first impression of the guy, alongside him attempting to inject himself into his business with Hera, Beerus had had the feeling that he was going to end up being quite the annoyance. Perhaps not as much as Hera had been while they were stuck in Kronos' stomach, but more than enough to make him almost insufferable to deal with. The former G.O.D had to admit though, when he did get more involved, at least for that day, Zeus hadn't been nearly as bad as he was expecting. Rather, he'd shown himself to be at the very least tolerable in Beerus's eyes. Zeus was still somewhat tense around him after he'd laid down the law, but he did end up relaxing around him quite a bit more upon realizing he wasn't going to bite his head off without reason. That and once Rhea had let him in on what her plan had actually been, he'd warmed up to him just a little bit. Once he was made aware that if he had somehow failed to break through the Titan King's gut that they would have been freed from there regardless due to Zeus being able to fool him into accepting a potion that would have made him vomit him out, he felt he could at least give his youngest sibling a chance to get more on his good side. Well, so long as he made sure to remember his warning, of course. If he continued to do that, he could see the two of them getting along reasonably well. Yesterday and night overall had been pretty nice, all things considered. About the only thing that would have made it better was if he'd been able to get his complete vengeance upon Kronos just before arriving in this place. That, however, was something he intended to fix soon enough. Right as he walked through the yellowish field covering his doorway and stepped into the cave's tunnel that connected throughout the entire mountain, his amber eyes fell immediately on a sight he neither needed nor wanted. Oh, Beerus. Zeus grinned in a more relaxed manner than he'd seen before, as both he and Metis stepped out of their room together right in front of him, as their room sat opposite of his own. Did you have a good rest, brother? The silver-haired deity asked in a far less tense tone than he'd had with him before, though he could still hear a tinge of nervousness, as he distractedly chose to nuzzle his face in the crook of his lover's neck in a teasing manner, whilst circling an arm around her waist to bring her closer, which garnered a soft moan from the Oceanid. Something that was probably done to not only stop himself from getting more anxious as much as it was him wanting to enjoy himself more than he already had. A fact that wouldn't have been bad and the elder brother wouldn't have minded or cared about, had it not been for them both being stark naked. Because I certainly know I did. You're insatiable, you know that. Metis remarked amusedly, her hair a total mess and her legs quivering beneath, before she saw the look on Beerus's face. It didn't take her even half a second to notice how her lover's elder brother cringed at them. Something that made her switch gears quickly, as she decided to end their antics for the moment. I think that's enough for now, Zeus. We had more than enough fun all last night, and I get the feeling your brother isn't too keen on seeing us be intimate like this in front of him. Oh gee, whatever gave her that idea? Ah, you're right. Zeus agreed, looking over to see his brother's less than enthused expression, the man's face scrunched up badly as though he'd just tasted something unbelievably sour, as he averted his gaze. The long silver-haired god's member protruding right out from between his consort's shapely legs, as he leaned back in to give her a kiss on the cheek. How inconsiderate of us, he said, before unwrapping his arm from around her to let her go. This got him a playful slap on his shoulder from her. Her ample, modestly large D-cup breasts jiggling and swaying with erect, bright red nipples grazing through the cool air that traveled through the cave as she stepped out and away from his half-erect manhood. Zeus had to resist the urge to not cop a feel of her plump ass as she did, watching it give a nice, light wobble as though her butt cheeks were made of jelly. Inconsiderate of you, you mean? She snipped back with a bemused grin, as her body lit up for a split second, before dissipating back to reveal she was now covered in her standard tunic. You're the one all too excited to go further on with those hands and package of yours. She continued, as she started to make her way down the tunnel. Don't go acting as though you're wholly innocent, dear, especially not with how much you were begging me for more mere hours ago. Zeus called back cheekily, his nervousness around his brother forgotten momentarily as he took his eyes off of Beerus for a brief instant, his body glowing the same way hers had done, before dissipating to reveal him dressed back up in his own tunic. I'm not going to even deign that with a proper response, she said without looking back, partially because she couldn't think of anything to bite back with at the moment, and partially because he had her there. Not that she was about to admit as such openly. I'll see you both in a bit. I'm just going to check on the others. With that, the second-generation Titaness took her leave further down the tunnelway, and out of the two male deities' immediate sight. So, Is there a problem, brother? Zeus asked, his tone slightly nervous despite his best efforts, yet at the same time remarkably innocent, as he turned his gaze back to the purple-haired god. Beerus's head turned, mind thankful that his younger brother was now dressed, as his eyes practically bore a hole through his skull. Left brow twitching in disturbed agitation. A problem, you ask? Was this asshat trying to take the piss out of him, or something? Oh, right. Zeus winced seeing his brother's expression darken. Sorry about just now, I guess. Was a little too excited after last night, I suppose. He commented in earnest, before splaying an arm out in the direction his consort had gone down. Could you really blame me this time though, when it comes to her? Because, in my defense brother, last night especially she was quite the... Stop. Beerus cut him off with a groan, pinching his eyes shut with his index finger and thumb. Not wanting to hear any more about where Zeus was obviously going. Just stop. I really don't care to learn about what you both do in the bedroom. You've already scarred me enough as it is. He was already rethinking what he'd thought not a minute ago, about giving the younger deity a chance. Ah, scarred you. Don't you think you're exaggerating just a little bit? Zeus couldn't help but ask awkwardly, bringing down his raised arm back to his side. No. Beerus's hand came back down as his eyes opened and glared at his youngest sibling, enough to make a bead of nervous sweat drop from the silver-haired god's temple. I was in a good mood after having a nice nap, and then you had to go and ruin it as soon as I stepped out. Ugh, it was going to take quite the amount of mental willpower to bleach the abhorrent image of a certain part of the younger god's anatomy, especially from his mind. I couldn't care less what you two do with each other. Have at it. But would it have killed you to put your tunic on before you came out? Because I really didn't need to see that. Wait, your problem was with us, or me in specific, being nude. Zeus blinked in mild surprise, and Beerus's annoyance grew at how that seemed to take him aback. As to why it took him by surprise that the formerly feline deity wouldn't be keen on, or in this case was repulsed by seeing a family member, male especially, naked before his eyes at the ass crack of morning, the ex-G.O.D didn't even want to bother entertaining. Yes, you moron. The elder of the two replied tersely. And let me make this clear to you, just so we're on the same page. If I ever wake up from a nap and you strut out naked like that with you know what dangling at me again, Beerus proceeded to point below the electric blue-eyed god's waist, before making a none too pleasant snipping motion with his fingers that was impossible to misconstrue. His amber pools promising a painful future if his words were not heeded. I promise you you'll lose it pretty damn quick. Understand? Crystal. Zeus said back rather quickly, giving an overly affirmative, almost comical nod of his head as one hand subconsciously moved to shield his crotch. His complexion paling over as more beads of sweat trickled down his forehead in alarm over the threat of his manhood being removed. Especially since so far, the older brother had yet to bluff on anything he'd said. Good. Now if you'll excuse me, Beerus turned and started to make his way down the tunnelway opposite to where Metis had gone, where he knew would lead to the entrance. I've got some vengeance to undertake. Huh. Vengeance. It took a small moment for the purple-haired god's words to fully register in Zeus's head, but once they did, his eyes shot wide open. Wait, hold on there, brother. Zeus quickly called out as he quickly dashed in front of his brother. Whoa, 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 hang on there a minute. Zeus spoke in an even more alarmed tone, pushing his hands out in front of him close to his brother's chest in a placating manner. An act that managed to get Beerus to halt for the moment. You're not thinking of going after Kronos already, are you? Beerus rose a brow. And why wouldn't I? I didn't make that proclamation to him and his merry band of buffoons before I punched a hole in his castle for the heck of it. I meant what I said, and I intend to do so as soon as possible. Does it have to be this soon, though? It's only been a day. Yes, and I helped get you all back here safe and sound, had that whole mushy reunion with our mother, and got to have a pleasant nap. Now, with you all no longer in the crossfire, I'd say I'm more than ready to storm back up to whatever is left of that place and finish what I started. Brother, I mean no offense to you, really, I don't, but I must advise you against such an idea. Duly noted. Beerus nodded, before grabbing a hold of his brother's highly muscled shoulder. Now get out of the way, he added dismissively, as he easily wrenched him to the side and out of his way, almost pulling Zeus off his feet altogether and forcing him to jitter on the flats of his feet just to maintain his balance. Hold on. Not one to give up so easily, Zeus swiftly got his bearings back and moved to catch up once again, the two nearing the mountain cave's entrance already, seeing as both their rooms were near the top of the mountain and the closest to it. Once he did catch up, he grabbed a hold of his brother's shoulder to stop him once again, just as the rays of Helios began to shine through and onto his face. I know you want to take down our father more than anyone else, Beerus, and I know we're not exactly on good terms, but please just listen to me. You going back up there right now on your lonesome, when they're no doubt on high alert right now after what happened, isn't going to end well for you. Oh. Beerus tilted his head and eyed his bearded cohort with a sharp, closing in on dangerous gleam. Are you doubting my power now? And no. Not at all. Zeus quickly, and wisely, shook his head vehemently. I witnessed firsthand what you were capable of. I would be a fool to do so. And yet you are getting in the way of me going back up to that mountain to pay that jackass, father, of ours his just deserts. Care to explain? I'm doing that because I feel you are being too hasty, brother. You may be strong, far more so right now than I am, but I promise you that won't be enough. Please, take heed and be a bit more patient. You did say whether it took days, weeks, months or years, you'd destroy Kronos, yes. Why not take a hint then and slow down for a bit? Perhaps stick around to help our siblings grow into their own powers, help them, and perhaps me as well, become more powerful. Maybe not as strong as you've somehow managed to get, but enough to where we can aid you in taking down Kronos and the Titans later. Zeus finished with a hopeful tone, seeing a benefit in them all standing together as one against the Titans that'd no doubt be coming for them now, rather than letting their strongest and currently most reliable sibling go at it alone. Beerus, however, wasn't exactly on board. Yeah, I'll pass. He waved him off, shirking his hand away from his shoulder, as he made to continue walking. As tempting as that is, I'm not really the patient sort. When I want something, I prefer to go for it as fast as possible without delay, as I'm sure you're already well aware of after I smashed mine and the other's way out of Kronos' stomach, rather than sitting put and waiting to be rescued like a helpless child. That and all the other times back in his previous life he'd gone out into the cosmos for a decent meal or what he thought might be a good fight. I'd say I'm more than powerful enough to take on all 6 of those so-called titans. In fact, Beerus smirked confidently as he looked forward while reaching a hand up to his neck and cracking it in a form of anticipation. I'd welcome 'em to try and gang up on me. Should at least give me more of a challenge. Foolishness. You are exceptionally strong, but clearly too impetuous, young one. Huh. Beerus's smirk fell, his expression becoming one of confusion at the voice that was most certainly not Zeus, or anyone he'd heard for that matter, rebuking him. A distinctly feminine one, but that was about all he could tell, as his head swiveled around in a fruitless search for its wielder. Who said that? Zeus, on the other hand, had gained a look of recognition. Hold on, I know that voice. I would certainly hope that you do, Zeus. Seeing as I helped raise you for the first 2 weeks of your life. The feminine voice spoke out again, this time with a small bit of humor. Beerus's confusion only mounted. Where was this voice coming from? It couldn't be telepathic, because he couldn't feel a presence in his mind, and he couldn't see anyone around them. Furthermore, it sounded like her voice was coming from nearly all directions at once. Almost as if it was coming from below you, young one. The voice stated where his own thoughts had been going. Though, since this is our first proper meeting, I suppose it wouldn't hurt to reveal myself to you in a form you're more accustomed to. Just then, the very earth in front of Beerus and Zeus, right around the entrance, began to give way, as a very familiar being to Zeus began to briskly rise out of the rocky surface, just as she'd done with Rhea on the day of the latter's birth. First came the hair, long flowing and the color of purest soil, before the unmistakable shape of a voluptuous humanoid female came with. Her form just as bare and covered in lusciously saturated, bright green moss across her chest, upper arms, slim waist, curvaceous hips and thick thighs as the last time she'd shown herself like this. And the silver-haired male didn't doubt her ass was just as firm and round in this form as it had been before. Her skin no less resplendent than the healthiest of roots within the earth, and her eyes blooming with a radiant green that rivaled the most flourishing greenery. The primordial goddess of the earth smiled maternally at the two brothers as her body completed its formation, accentuated with a pertinent bounce of her large G-cup breasts. The sun's rays curiously framing her sublimely at all angles and punctuating her grandeur that much more, as they cast over and around her figure. Zeus had to stop himself from gulping audibly and hide a certain traitorous part of his anatomy beneath his tunic, as Gaia revealed herself in all her splendor. Her face just as beautiful, and hourglass figure just as stacked and perfectly proportioned as they'd been the last time he'd seen this form of her. The mother of nature's supple, round mounds of flesh being perhaps the most eye-catching as the impossibly perky duo came to a rest from the prior bounce over the goddess's chest, with the brownish nipples, at least to him, jutting out just as proud and true as budding plants that grew from her more earthen body. Beerus, meanwhile, simply blinked at the sight of the naked beauty that was Mother Nature personified. Words failing him for a brief instant at the unexpectedness of an encounter like this. His own eyes ending up soaking in every inch of her appearance that he could see from time to bottom. Not necessarily out of any sort of physical attraction, mind you, but a part of him would be lying if he said he didn't appreciate the much more appealing visage to help his mind forever burn the cringe-inducing image of the lower part of his younger brother's anatomy from his mind faster. There. Better, young one. The primordial asked with a sliver of amusement at the owlish look she got from the elder of the two, as she propped a hand on one of her wide hips. I guess. Better was certainly one way to describe it. And just who are you? Oh, my apologies. How rude of me. She said with a hint of apology in her tone. I am Gaia, young one. The primordial goddess of the earth, and the progenitor of all life in the universe. Progenitor of all life in the universe, huh? Quite the lofty position you have there. Beerus commented back much more calmly, having recovered quick from his initial surprise. His mind not doubting her claim of such for even a second, given not only the sincerity in her voice, but also the sheer presence she exuded before him. It strangely reminded him of Shin in a small way, as it held a similar sort of unique feel to it as the creator gods, though to say that meant her power was equivalent to Shin's, he felt would be a grave insult to the woman. She was by no means as weak as the Kai was. Using roughly the same technique as he did with his ki, Beerus could get a sense of her power right now, but even if he couldn't, her nudiness aside, her presence alone affirmed to his honed battle instincts that she was exponentially more powerful than his former associate had ever been. Though, as to how powerful she truly was, he couldn't quite say, as he wasn't able to push much deeper than that. He did have a feeling in his gut, however, that what he was feeling now was but a minuscule drop of an incredibly vast ocean of divine power. Still, to him, that didn't mean much. Regardless, he continued, ignoring her nudity entirely at this point, as he placed his hands on his hips, his tone taking on a bit more dangerous edge. I believe I heard you refer to what I said before as foolishness, and then say I was being too impetuous, right? Yes, I did. The primordial goddess nodded. And you were. She added without a shred of hesitation, totally unmoved by the sharp look he gave her then. Rushing back to Mount Othries without a plan, even with your impressive level of power, will only lead to your own downfall. Beerus scoffed. Oh please, and what would you know? I handled myself just fine with the buffoons on top of that mountain yesterday, and had it not been for me needing to keep my family out of the crossfire, I would have taken them all out, if necessary. Whilst I admire and appreciate your willingness to put your family first, I'm afraid I'll have to disagree with you on that last part. She shook her head in the negative. I did not sense any of my children achieve their ascension the other day, so I can surmise fairly quick that you only fought against their lesser states. Something that, if what you said is true, will have any one of them ascend as soon as they have you in their sights again, and should they do that, you'll be defeated rather swiftly as you are, young one. Gia finished with a tone of finality, as though she was stating nothing but a cold, hard fact. Me. Defeated by one of them. Preposterous. He wouldn't dare ever lose to jackoffs like them. The very thought would have made him laugh, had it not been for the aggravation bubbling up within him at how she was cutting him down. That was something that was very much beginning to seriously get on his nerves. Still, he found himself tempering his anger for now, as two particular details of what she'd said sunk into his mind. A mixture of both incredulity and intrigue coming out as he spoke back. Hold on, did you just say that Kronos and his gaggle of idiots are your children? And what do you mean by, achieve their ascension? The latter to him sounded like they all had a transformation of sorts. With the exception of Atlas, yes. Kronos and his brothers are my children, as are their wives. Beerus's eyes widened rather comically and almost felt himself choke on that last particular tidbit. Hold on, their wives too. You mean to tell me that they got involved with each other as siblings? If by involved, you mean they married each other and had their own children together, then yes. Gia tilted her head and gave Beerus an odd look as he winced hard. I fail to see how that's an issue. It is only natural, after all. She really just said that, didn't she? And made it sound like he was the one being weird here, what the fuck? The once anthropomorphic cat didn't know what was worse. The fact that his new parents, one of which he intended to destroy, were brother and sister, which where he came from originally carried some seriously foul connotations, or the fact that inwardly, for some bizarre reason, he couldn't feel anywhere near the amount of revulsion he should have for such a bomb being dropped on him. Perhaps just as bad, Even though he now knew the woman in front of him was essentially his grandmother, he didn't feel put off by her being pretty much naked in front of him in the slightest. Nor did he feel in any way disturbed by the image of her being nude in his mind now. If anything, it somehow felt as though nothing had changed, and the image of her nudeness in his head was still far more appealing than Zeus, even though it really shouldn't have been. He knew for damn sure that if a thought like this had crossed his mind back in his universe 7 days about his grandmother, whether she could be considered attractive or not, he would have thrown up in his mouth on principle. And then promptly slapped himself for good measure to rid himself of such a repulsive thought. So then, for the love of whatever higher power out there was listening, why the hell was this scenario any different? Had his rebirth into this world screwed with his head or something, and he'd only just now realized? Whilst Beerus was busy having an inner meltdown, Gia merely shrugged at his odd reaction before briefly turning her attention to the younger brother. Is he going to be all right? Zeus, who up to this point had been quiet, seemed to snap out of whatever thoughts he was having, and it didn't take a genius to know what on, considering where his eyes had been, though few men would blame him for that. Huh. Oh, Beerus. He glanced over at his brother, whose befuddled expression had become so pronounced by this point that it looked as though he was mind-fucked. Laying a hand back on his shoulder, Zeus gave him a light shake. You all right there, brother? Beerus made a throaty noise that sounded like a sickly groan, as he shook his head to and fro, coming back to reality. Ugh, I really wish I hadn't asked. He muttered whilst giving himself a facepalm. In this case, ignorance truly would have been bliss. Hadn't asked what? Zeus broached curiously with a raised eyebrow. Not important. Beerus dodged the question entirely, and decided it was best if he just ignored that subject altogether. No longer wanting to put thought into that interesting reality he'd just been made aware of if he could help it. It only made him far more confused with himself than it had any right to. Shrugging Zeus's hand off once more, the former G.O.D was about to get back on a more pressing topic, when he was interrupted by the familiar voice of Rhea behind them. Oh. Mother. You decided to show yourself, did you? Beerus and Zeus looked behind them to see their mother moving closer towards them. A look of mild surprise on her face at the sight of her own mother as she stopped just a foot away. She didn't notice the way Beerus's eye twitched and his face scrunched up briefly at her, indeed, referring to the woman as mother. Something that essentially confirmed what Gia had told him before to be true. That I did, dear daughter. Gia smiled kindly at her second eldest daughter. I decided it was prudent to do so whilst I talked with your oldest son and advise him against seeking out his father for the time being. A decision that would have been most unwise by himself as he is. Even with the tremendous power I sense from him. Rhea looked over at Beerus and seemed to look at him with concern. You were going to go after him this soon? HMPH. And why not? He shrugged. I already told you what I managed to do before our escape from the castle, and seeing as I'm not really the patient type, with the others here now, why not just go back there now and finish my business? I've already told you why you shouldn't, unless you want to be on the losing end, young one. Gia interjected, bringing Beerus's attention, and by proxy his mother and brothers, back to her, as she stepped forward. Making no attempt to cover her massive mountains of flesh, bobbling and jiggling excitedly as she did. Something a certain silver-haired sibling beside him couldn't help but appreciate. Beerus eyed her weirdly as she moved rather close to his personal space, the top of her head coming just up to his chin as she stopped mere inches away from him. her vivacious green pools unflinching as she stared up into Beerus's amber eyes, the wobbling of her magnificent melons only just simmering down as she reached up and placed a hand placatingly on his cheek. I'll give you this, as it stands right now, from what I can sense of you, the depths of your power certainly exceeds that of Kronos and his brethren when in their lesser states, without question. She complimented earnestly, as she started to caress his cheek in a caring manner. Beerus immediately felt some discomfort as she did, due to him not being one for such blatantly affectionate gestures, especially for someone he'd only just met. However, before he could react and shrug her hand off his face, he felt a similar pulse of calming aura to his sister Hestia's, only more potent. So much so, he surprisingly had to stop himself from completely sagging as the tension disappeared and leaning into her touch instinctively. Not totally unlike how he would have into a cozy pillow. My intention here is neither to disrespect you, nor to downplay your own strength, as even I must admit what I sense from you, especially given your circumstances, is quite shocking indeed. In fact, I don't feel it is an exaggeration to say that your potential may well be greater than anything I've ever felt before. Incredibly so. Mother Nature acknowledged, before cutting it down with what she saw as cold, hard reality. However, that power of yours would be no match for any one of them in their true divine forms. Ah, so it was a transformation of sorts that they all had in the back pocket. With his more angered side quelled due to the primordial goddess's aura, Beerus had the more reasonable and logical track of his mind taking in what she'd said with the utmost seriousness, even when she could apparently sense his current power level. That was enough to give him pause, as while he did have a bit of an ego to him, he wasn't stupid. Whilst there was a part of him still that wanted to move her out of his way and trek out anyway, he knew to trust his own gut as it rarely, if ever, let him down. And right now, it was telling him to hear her out for now, if for no other reason than these true divine forms she spoke of piquing his interest. True divine forms, huh? Care to elaborate for me? It is the ascended state of being, Beerus, where one reaches their individual zenith of power, by becoming one with all of the essence of the domains at once. She revealed, deciding to just call him by name at this point. Essence of the domains. Beerus didn't even try to hide his lack of knowledge on that particular bit, nor his growing intrigue. This time, Gia rose a bemused brow. You don't know of domains either. Her gaze then shifted over both Beerus and Zeus's muscular shoulders towards her daughter, as she brought her hand down from Beerus's cheek. Strange. I would have thought you'd have at least mentioned some of this to him, Rhea. Glancing behind him again, both Zeus and Beerus in particular saw the sheepish look she gave at that. To her credit though, she didn't shy away from looking at him even when put on the spot like this. Sorry, mother. I guess I was just so overjoyed to be back with my children that some things just slipped my mind yesterday. The Earth Mother sighed, but no less gave an understanding nod. And as Beerus looked back again, he saw the sympathy in her expression. That is understandable, I suppose. I know more than anyone the pain you had to endure to allow your foolish brother husband to devour most of them. And to think, I once had hope that he would be better than his own father. She shook her head despondently. His fear over Aranos's prophecy may well have made him worse than he was. There was that talk about this prophecy again. A part of him would concede to being curious of it, after several mentions, but for the most part, Beerus couldn't be bothered to care about it. All that mattered to him, at the end of the day, was getting his retribution on that child-eating ass clown. Nothing else mattered as far as he was concerned on the, from what Rhea had told him the other day, current ruler of the universe. A title he'd be foregoing with not too long from now. Regardless, Gia started, as she turned her attention back to Beerus. It seems as though you still have quite a bit to learn, Beerus. So please, for your own sake, hold back here with your siblings for now, and plan ahead instead of just blindly rushing in. Beerus seemed to mull this all over for a bit in his head, propping his chin on a closed fist as a thoughtful expression adorned his face. Come now, brother. Please, listen to what she's said and take it to heart. Zeus chimed in hopefully. I know we may not be on the best terms right now, seeing as I haven't done a good job at making a decent impression, but I assure you we're on the same side here. You aren't the only one who despises Kronos and wants to see him taken down, he said while placing an understanding hand upon Beerus's shoulder once more, and when his elder brother didn't just immediately shrug it off, he continued. I want him taken down too, as I'm sure the rest of our siblings do, for the atrocities he committed to them and you purely for his own gain. I'm willing to lend you all my aid, as I'm sure the rest of our siblings are as well, to see to it that he is. All you need is let us help our siblings and me to grow ourselves in whatever way you can, and when the time comes, we can stand side by side on the battlefield as a MMHPH. That's enough. I get it. Beerus responded with a roll of his eyes as he plugged his hand against Zeus's mouth to shut him up, looking over to give his little brother a flat stare. You can cut it out with the speech already. I heard it well enough the first time. I take it you have an answer then? Gia asked inquisitively, inwardly hoping that he wouldn't be rash and go out on his own even after her warnings. That he'd see the sense in what she had relayed to him. Answer me this first. Beerus replied back, taking his eyes, and his hand, off of Zeus's mouth, and then promptly wiping said hand over his tunic, in case they'd been somewhere he really needn't know about. You said that this, true divine form, is achieved by bringing all the essence or whatever from a domain and becoming one with it. Can I take that to mean that if I were to get one of these domains for myself, that I would then be able to gain my own true divine form, then? That is correct. Gia nodded. If you manage to get even just one, then you'll have the capacity to achieve one for yourself. Although even if you do gain one, it won't be a simple task to ascend with it. Alright then. Beerus grinned. You want me to pull back and remain here? Fine. I'll play it your way, but under one condition. And pray tell, what would that be, Beerus? If I'm to stay here for a time, then seeing as you seem to have all the answers that I need, how about you show me yourself how I can go about getting one of these domains, and then teach me how to become one with it, so I can even the playing field. His request didn't fail to take Gia, as well as Zeus and Rhea by surprise. You want me to be your teacher? Why wouldn't I? If you are the progenitor of all life, as you claim, then you've been around longer than anyone here in this universe, I'd imagine, which means you must know how everything works better than anyone. If I'm to allow myself to be taught by anyone, I'd prefer it to be by the best I could get. He wouldn't settle for anything less. His last mentor had been Whis after all, and in terms of knowledge to grant down to him, the angel had been rivaled only by his fellow brothers and sisters, and surpassed only by his father who would never have trained him personally. Right now, far as I can see, that seems to be you. Gia simply let out a good-natured giggle. It had been quite some time since she'd been given praise like that. You flatter me, Beerus. Though, I guess you're not exactly wrong with that. You are aware though that you're asking me to aid you in taking down my own son, right? Very. Beerus's grin took on a savage edge. No offense, but after all he's done, he deserves nothing less. You can refuse if you want, but if you do, I'll personally test out for myself if your claims are true, when I storm your oafish son's castle for round 2. Such a decision will only end up disastrous for you, Beerus. Gia shook her head in some form of disbelief at his gumption. It was almost funny to her that he didn't seem to get along with Zeus, when from where she was standing, they seemed to have more in common than he knew. Still, he wanted an answer, and she didn't really have much else to do at the moment. And in all honesty, her son really had crossed the line with her already, when he did the one thing she could never forgive her former consort for when he did it the first time. Now that got her thinking, all right, Beerus. I'll help you to achieve ascendancy, but if I may, I'd like to request a favor from you as well. You're going to ask him to free them from Tartarus, aren't you, mother? Rhea asked concernedly, able to tell just from the look in her mother's eyes what she wanted. Hard for her to forget, seeing as she'd seen the same look before many moons ago, when she'd asked it of Kronos. Gia sighed. You're correct, dear daughter. And why would I not? They never should have been put in there in the first place. The goddess's voice rose with a hint of anger as she swiped an arm through the air to show a bit of her frustration. The action causing her ginormous globes to jiggle profusely like large slabs of jelly, whilst her brownish buds drew jagged lines in the air. The Cyclopes and Hecatonches have done nothing to deserve the awful treatment they've been given, first by their father, and now by their brother no less. Cyclopes. Heca, what now? Hold on a second. Beerus interjected. What's this about me freeing who now? My other sons. Gia elaborated, moving her full focus back to Beerus. They've been trapped down in the pits of Tartarus by Kronos not too long ago. All for the crime of the unsightly nature and annoying antics. The sarcasm and anger were felt in equally high measure by the two brothers in front of her, and their mother behind them, as she repeated Kronos's reasons for imprisoning them. She still couldn't believe the unmitigated gall of Kronos to spout such nonsense to her. I would be more than willing to personally aid in your growth if you promise me to free your uncles once more from their unjust prison. The primordial, heavily endowed deity raised a hand up and offered it as a show of agreement. I can guarantee you they'll be grateful if you do and will be powerful allies for you and your siblings. So, what do you say, Beerus? Do you accept? Well, they would have a bone to pick with him, similar to what he did. Not that he personally cared about gaining allies in the slightest. Still, if Kronos had gotten rid of them because he couldn't stand the sight of them, then he supposed he could go to whatever this Tartarus place was and bust them out. Not because he cared about their well-being or anything, but just as a way to spite Kronos before he inevitably put him down. And yes, he was aware of just how petty that was, and didn't give even the slightest beginnings of a damn about it. Fair enough. Beerus nodded, as he took her hand in his. I accept. You've got yourself a deal. Wonderful. Gia smiled back beatifically. I'm glad that you agree. Her eyes then glowed an iridescent green, and Beerus felt a strong, protective pulse of energy spreading out all around them. The entire Isle of Crete is now under the same protective layer as the mountain. Now you should have plenty of space to train, as will your siblings, without worry of Kronos spotting you from up above. Provided none of them broke the Isle, of course, even with her own divine magic reinforcing it. Though that particular bit didn't need to be said. We can begin as soon as you like. Begin what? The trio turned at the familiar voice of Metis behind them, seeing the Oceanid come to a stop a good few feet away, on her lonesome. The second-generation Titaness's eyes widening in surprise seeing the primordial goddess of the earth and nature herself stood before her. Lady Gia, why are you? Metis, was it? Beerus cut the woman off, grabbing her attention. I assume since you've come back here alone, that must mean the others, other than our mother here, are still resting, yes? He said while jutting a thumb at said woman for emphasis. Yes, they are. She nodded, choosing not to take offense to being rudely cut off, but no less inquisitive now as to what she'd just missed. Why do you ask? Be sure to bring 'em outside for me once they're ready. Beerus's grin was almost splitting his face by now, as his amber eyes shone with a distinct purple and gold hue. We've all got some training to do. The Olympian god of destruction. Chapter 8, The Titanomachy. Atop Mount Othries. Lord Kronos, sir, Atlas began, kneeling before the leader of the Titans, as he sat upon his throne in his personal throne room. The Titan Lord's wound left behind by Beerus had closed up a while ago, as had his tunic, making it appear as though he'd never been genuinely hurt in the slightest. His face itself was like stone, showing no outward emotion. It was his eyes, however, as Atlas gazed up at the universe's ruler, that made it blatantly clear what his true emotions were at the current juncture. His dark brown eyes set into a cold, vicious glare that spoke volumes about how livid he truly was at present. Report. Kronos's gravelly voice spoke, uttering just a single word as he leaned over his throne, his hands gripping against the magically enforced armrests of what had once been his own father's seat he'd used while overseeing the entire world. His tone sounding so icy and chilling even to Atlas, his own ally, that it felt like time itself had frozen over then and there, despite Kronos having not yet willed it so. Atlas simply nodded and got to it, not wanting his leader in his current mood to feel like he was wasting his time. The damage left to the fortress by the new god who we've now come to know as Beerus. My son. Kronos cut him off briefly. Those two words alone filled with nothing but barely contained venom, as his eyes narrowed like slits. The air, no, the very space and time, around him rippling and distorting with his bubbling contempt and rage. Your son. The broadly built Titan acknowledged, to his credit, without so much as even the tiniest stutter, seeing how much just mentioning the purple-haired deity got under the king's divine skin. The damage he dealt to our fortress has been fixed up for a start, though I must report, it took longer than it should have. Yes, Kronos hissed, nursing his midsection where his bastard child had bust out, freeing himself and the rest of his damn spawn in the process. I'd already caught on to that when it took far longer than it should have for the hole he punched in my gut to heal up. Atlas's features only winced minorly at being given such a reminder, recalling himself how his lord's son had embarrassed him too. Yes, well, while we're on that, my lord, it would seem that word of what occurred earlier has traveled throughout Mount Othries. Hardly surprising, seeing as my bastard son chose to smash his way out of our domain and damage the mountain itself. Kronos would have been shocked if there was even one being, whether in this domain or close by, that hadn't either felt, heard or saw a section of the castle and the massive mountain shattering and falling down to the earth below. Something like that is impossible to miss, and I wouldn't doubt those nymphs that ran off also spilled the beans on such an embarrassment. You're not wrong on that. I spoke with Hyperion before I arrived here, and it seems as though his wife Thea, and most likely the other Titanesses that dwell here, have been made acutely aware of what happened. Won't be much longer now for it to travel beyond this domain, what with all the ruckus the news is causing, if it's not in the process of doing so already. Have you spoken to Rhea since, my king? Kronos' eyes narrowed as his expression darkened, and Atlas immediately got the sense that something had gone wrong. No, but if her lack of presence in my castle, and anywhere near Mount Othries is anything to go by, I'm sure she's well aware as well. Wait, the queen is gone? Atlas asked, seeing the calculating, and if he could be frank, downright paranoid look that his leader's eyes held on the subject of Rhea. Yes. And given the convenience of her absence coming on the same day that an escape of our children took place, a part of me suspects she knew something like this would occur. How so, my lord? Not that I doubt your word, but... Atlas. Kronos cut off his second in command, leveling him with a cold, pondering stare. Tell me, do you recall the amount of my kin that came out of me earlier? The amount. Atlas blinked in confusion, not sure where his leader was going with this. Still, he knew better than to question his ruler's train of thought and gave that a quick moment to ponder before replying. If I recall, there was about 6 of them, including that bastard Beerus. Why do you ask? I didn't pay much mind to it at the time, on account of all the drama that my son caused for us, but looking back now, I've come to realize that of all the children of mine that came out when that unruly son of mine punched my stomach open, there was one that was suspiciously absent from the lot. The 7th and most recent child Rhea bore for me was nowhere to be seen in the group of my spawn that escaped me. Atlas remained silent, as he ruminated on the implications of such a thing being the case. He of course had been told of the cursed prophecy that his grandfather Uranos had handed down to Kronos by his own father a while back, and also knew this to be the reason why he got rid of any children he sired with Rhea. If one had been missing, as his king had said, that could only mean. I see you're realizing the true issue at hand there. Kronos noted, seeing the dawning look of comprehension on the muscle-bound Titan's features. It would appear that whatever Rhea handed me the day our latest child was born, it certainly wasn't the newborn. His eyes flashed with anger at that. And adding to that, do you recall the gift that so-called son of my eldest brother, the one called Zeus, supposedly handed up on his behalf as an apology? Atlas nodded slowly. The potion. What about it? Kronos chuckled darkly, though there wasn't even a shred of humor in his voice. Would you believe that a small bit of it still remained on my hand even after I crushed it? The Titan Lord raised a hand near his face and turned his gaze towards it, almost boring a hole through it as though it had been part of an awful joke. Funny thing was, now that it was touching my skin, I could sense the magic that was put into it. HMPH. To think, that cheeky little shit had the gall to call it a taste enhancer. Atlas didn't even have to ask to know just by the sound of Kronos' tone that what Zeus had told him was a lie. Kronos continued, only this time with the very space around them beginning to ripple and bend with his growing fury. If he hadn't chosen that moment to blast my gut open, and I'd been foolish enough to put this in my drink, that taste enhancer would have had me puking and retching my guts out. Atlas's eyes widened slightly. But wouldn't that mean? Yes, Atlas. In other words, it would seem as though my spawn were destined to come out of me today one way or another. Oh, the convenience of it all. One child missing from the group that got out of his innards, and then some young god who he'd never seen before shows up with a daughter of Oceanus, claiming to be his son, on the very day that his wife coincidentally leaves without a word, and gives him a potion potent enough to have him puke out his offspring, had his purple-haired progeny not somehow made his way out the hard way. It would appear I allowed myself to be conned by you, Rhea. I should have been paying more attention that day you handed me whatever was wrapped in that blanket. Not that it would have mattered, seeing as his eldest son would have punctured a hole in him regardless, but it was the intent that counted. I should have known you wouldn't let what I was doing go, and even more so that how you've been recently, showering me with all that affection and sex, it was all just an act, wasn't it? Despite my caution, I grew too complacent around you, it seems. That would be something he'd have to rectify eventually, preferably when he dealt with his escaped children first. Zeus included, it seemed, and Beerus especially. Seated on what was once his father's throne, he not only could cast his gaze from the heavens down to the infinite expanse of the world below, but could also feel more than ever the way the sky itself rumbled at him following Beerus's vow and his children's escape. It would seem that Uranos, even in his formless state, was laughing at him right now. No doubt enjoying seeing every second of his predicament, with his curse on him bearing fruit and relishing in what he saw as karma finally being served to the son who'd felled him all those years ago. Just as he'd foretold. Despite his best attempts, he felt the inkling of fear in the back of his head, that no matter what he did, he was doomed to fall at this point. Doomed to be overthrown by his eldest son and the rest of his children, the very thing he tried so hard to avoid. Such a thought, as it had done before, brought terror clenching at his very being. All before he crushed that even I've never quite seen that before. Well, that was interesting to hear, to say the least. Putting that aside though, she pressed on. Given that is the case, I wouldn't be surprised if when you do find the essence of destruction, for you more than anyone else perhaps, it'll feel like a piece of you that's been missing this whole time. A piece that's been missing this whole time. Beerus almost wanted to laugh. That was definitely some way to put it, all right. Very well then. He closed his eyes and began to stretch out his senses with enthusiasm. I guess there's nothing left other than for me to get to it, then. Sat there under the protogenous watchful gaze, Beerus searched. And searched. And searched. His senses scanning all around as much of this world as he could, for nothing else other than the metaphysical essence he sought. The fledgling deity had no idea how long had passed as he did. His only indication that any significant time had gone by at all, being the waning of the sun's rays upon him and the cooling of the air around his body. His patience didn't wane in this instance, however, for he knew the importance of this. He simply kept straining his senses, until. Is that it? Beerus thought, senses stretched out to the max as he felt his attention suddenly get pulled, well, he couldn't really say in which direction, as that was far too simple a term for something like this. But he could feel something that felt familiar. Not wasting time, he followed that feeling, like he was delving downwards into a deep ocean for a light that somehow managed to pierce through the ever-encroaching darkness. The closer he got, the stronger the sensation became. So much so, that Beerus almost lost focus entirely from the effect it was beginning to have on his soul. Undeterred, he pressed ever forward, until he was almost as close, so to speak, as he'd been to the mountain's essence before. As soon as he was, though, to his surprise, that's when he felt another pull on his being from close by. One that felt different from the one he was fingertips away, but that he felt no less of a strong inclination towards as the one before him. It too, strangely, felt familiar to him, but in a more recent way that he couldn't quite put his finger on, unlike the first. No, wait, he could. It felt destructive too, but in a different way. The one before him felt more raw, like the destruction power he'd held back in his destroyer days of his old universe. This one, though, it brought about flashes of that timeline debacle with Zamasu from the future and the Trunks kid for some reason. Its destructive essence felt more temporal in nature. He was almost tempted to go to it instead out of sheer curiosity, but he held himself back. This wasn't the time to be getting distracted. Whatever that domain was, if he still felt inclined, he'd look into it later. Now, however, he already had one to attend to. Forgetting about the other one for now, he put his full focus back into the first, more raw feeling one, and all but plunged himself spiritually right into it. As soon as he did, Beerus's entire body, mind and especially his soul quaked as he reached out for the essence's metaphorical heart and grabbed onto it with all his might. What had been just a light brush before with the mountains now felt like he was being enveloped head to toe right down to the very deepest depths of his being. It pressed in all around him like a cocoon, and Beerus's eyes nearly shot open again as a wave of euphoria he hadn't been expecting all but slammed into him like a freight train. On the outside, his body shook as his golden purple aura framed over him once again, this time appearing far thicker, and brimming more vibrantly than it ever had. This feels incredible, was Beerus's only thought, as Gia's words from earlier came true in a big way. This sensation, it was surreal. It really did feel like he'd been missing a part of himself that was just now patching itself back in where it belonged. It felt better than any food he'd ever sampled back in his old universe, even the most delicious food ever made, that he'd been able to smell all the way from his own planet. It sure as hell beat the small bit of excitement he'd felt on the rare occasion he'd gotten a decent fight, even though he was using but a fraction of his real power. Such was the case with his second bout against Son Goku in his newly attained God form. Heck, he'd dare say it almost felt downright orgasmic. This sensation continued on until eventually, like coming down from a high, it faded down as Beerus's eyes finally peeled open, and he noticed that he was no longer sitting. Glancing down, he recognized that at some point, he'd stood up without realizing it. It felt good, didn't it? He heard Gia say with amusement, which brought his attention back to the grinning goddess. It appears I may have understated the effect it may have on you. I don't think I've ever seen anyone in such bliss after latching onto their first domain. She giggled into one of her hands. What's so funny? Beerus blinked at her behavior, now fully aware of his surroundings once more, and the fact that the sun had set considerably from when they'd started. Oh, nothing. Nothing at all, young one. Gia deflected, but couldn't help letting another giggle out despite herself at a now rather confused Beerus's expense. He had no clue that he just expressed everything he was feeling in that moment on the outside as well. Good grief, the faces he made there, that just made my day. At the end, he might as well have had the face of someone in the middle of a climax. She was just going to keep that little tidbit to herself for now. Might be fun to come back to that later for some teasing material. HMPH. Whatever you say. Beerus shrugged off her behavior, having already stopped caring as he grinned like a madman. In any case, the first step of our little training session is done. I'm now completely latched onto the domain of destruction. Yes. That much is clear. She agreed, looking him over with a more analytical eye. I can definitely feel the change in you. Your inner power feels a lot more like Percy's now, but with your own unique tint to it. Hey. Beerus clenched and unclenched his hands into fists with newfound excitement as he felt his link to the domain established. And now that it was, he could practically taste the unfathomable depths of power it could afford him. I can't wait to test this out. Whoa now, slow down your horses, Beerus. The large-breasted goddess cut him off with a bit of mirth. Just because you're linked to it now, doesn't mean you can just hop on into using it without a problem. Far from it, in fact. We've barely even begun your training. Really now. She was honestly beginning to sound a little like Whis there, during his early years training to be the next destroyer of his old universe. Oh yes. This was the easy part, Beerus. You've still got 2 more steps to go, and each will be exponentially harder than this, and require your utmost attention and practice. Well, he was no stranger to that. Bring it on, then. We've still got time to. A yawn sprung out, cutting him off as an odd bout of tiredness suddenly came over him. We've still, what the? Getting tired already? She gave him a once-over, before nodding in understanding. Not looking surprised in the least. I thought as much. I forgot to mention this too, but the first time around attaching yourself to a domain, has the tendency to bring about tiredness as a side effect because of the added weight, for lack of a better term, on the soul. TCH. Seriously. She only chose now to tell him this. Now she really was beginning to remind him of Whis, and not in a good way. Don't worry, it'll pass. It's only a minor thing. You can nap it off, and it'll be gone. Fine. He let out an annoyed sigh, feeling his eyelids start to droop. Can you at least tell me what the second step entails, first? Gladly. She agreed. It involves you training to actually harness the essence of your newfound domain for yourself. Sounds, another yawn broke through. Simple enough. It sounds simple, yes. In practice though, it'll take a lot of effort and concentration over the course of quite a while to be able to pull upon the essence of your domain to any decent capacity. This part alone has taken years for some to accomplish, let alone the step that comes after. Years. Please, he'd have this down pat in a few months at most. He was more than used to putting in the work in training when needed, and this still didn't sound too dissimilar to what he'd done for attaining his God key way back when. He was confident of that. Guess I'll go back to the cave then and sleep this off, he said, almost yawning a third time as he made to walk off. You don't have to go all the way back there. You could just sleep on top of me, if you want. Huh. Beerus almost stumbled off his feet with that, his head whipping back around with an aghast expression. What? My now, what's with that look? Gia tilted her head with an innocent-looking expression of her own. It was a perfectly reasonable suggestion. Perfectly reasonable, his ass. Absolutely not. Stop messing around. Messing around. She quirked a brow. Whatever do you mean? I was merely offering you a more immediate place to have a nap. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong. Did this woman have a screw loose? Don't play dumb. He pointed at her accusingly. You know exactly what I mean, and the answer is no. He had no idea what she thought she was playing at, but he was not about to play to that tune anytime soon. I'd rather sleep on the ground, thank you very much. Gia made a face at him following that, one of disbelief that quickly morphed into a funny one, like she was trying to hold in a laugh. She soon had to bring her fist up and cough into it, in order to actually stop herself from doing so. Beerus. I think you've forgotten something here. Beerus watched the buxom primordial, following as she pointed to the ground first, before then pointing at herself with a very amused look on her face. About a moment later, in his tired mind, the cogs started turning. The reason why dawned on him then. And once it did, he might as well have looked like he'd sucked on a sour lemon, as he facepalmed with a groan. Oh right, you're the ground. Yes. And before, I was suggesting to you that it'd be simpler to sleep here rather than trek back to the cave. She stared at him with no small amount of merriment, as she struck a pose with both hands on her hips. Just what did you think I was proposing you to do, him? Beerus cringed. Ugh, never mind. He turned away, feeling a headache coming on. Ah. You thought I meant it that way, didn't you? Her smile turned suggestive. Just let it go. Forget I said anything. He said, as he closed his eyes and pinched the ridge of his nose in exasperation. My, how presumptive of you, Beerus. And the teasing tone was back full force. Suffocatingly so. I must say though, the idea isn't bad. It might even be fun, actually. Stop. He groaned again, hating where this had gone. Gia laughed at his expense heartily. Oh, all right. I'll let you off this time. You go and have your rest then. We'll start up again as soon as you've slept that off. Beerus began his trek back to the cave. Not wanting to sleep near, on, or whatever with Gia. Just so you know though, Beerus. Gia called out to his retreating form, voice full of humor as he made the mistake of glancing back. If you ever do want to, you need but only ask. She winked. You never know, after all. You might get lucky. Beerus could only scream internally, as he walked off with a wince. Even though he knew she was more than likely just joking with him, at least he hoped she was, that was still something he mentally couldn't fathom ever doing. No. A few days later. Demeter dear, what's the matter? Demeter glanced up at the concerned face of her mother by her side, as she kneeled on both knees. Oh, it's nothing, mother. Nothing. Rhea frowned sternly. Demeter, don't lie to me. I've been watching you all this entire time, and I can see you've been getting distracted more since we started. She glanced out over the terrain, at each of her children. Watching as her other daughters and sons under her wing sat in a similar position, spread out from one another, but looked far more relaxed and focused than the blonde-haired fledgling goddess did. I'm beginning to grow a little worried that you'll continue to lag behind the rest of your siblings at the rate you're going. Beerus wasn't the only one making progress. Under Rhea's guidance, each one of his siblings he'd once been imprisoned with were making decent strides towards harnessing their own innate powers. They'd all already tapped into the power they all held within, and were well on their way to bringing it out to the fore, moving just as fast, unbeknownst to them, as he had back in the stomach, due to her diligence thus far in showing him the way to go about it. Everyone, except for Demeter, who hadn't quite tapped into hers yet. Well, it's just, the daughter looked away with some bit of embarrassment. I don't know. Is it me? The mother thumbed her chest, looking ready to take the blame. Were my instructions not clear enough for you? I can make them more so if you need me to. It's not that. She shook her head somewhat dismally, giving a smile that seemed almost lackadaisical were it not for the hint of frustration in her olive brown eyes. What you told us to do is fine, it's just, I don't think I'm all that good at focusing on something for very long. I see. The Titaness nodded understandingly. So, it's a case where your mind tends to wander off its own. Yeah, he, she chuckled nervously, rubbing the back of her head sheepishly as the mother hit the nail on the head. I've sort of been like this from the start. Ask anyone here about it, I'm sure they'll let you know how absent-minded I can be. I'm sorry. Rhea sighed. This could be a real problem if not nipped in the bud ASAP. Don't be sorry, my child. It's okay. Now that I know the issue here, I should be able to come up with something to help you catch up. Okay. Demeter nodded, looking apologetic all the same. Now what to do about this? Rhea crossed her arms as she went into thought. Let's see here, she looked around, as though searching for some bit of inspiration. A critical eye out for anything that might strike an idea in her mind. Perhaps she could go further out east of the Isle and ask Metis her opinion. She'd grown up with many siblings herself from her own brother Oceanus and sister Tethys Union, so it was possible she might have seen this before and had some idea of how to deal with it. Then again, there was also a chance that she wouldn't simply because of how many brothers and sisters she had. There were so many that even Metis herself had admitted in one of their private conversations to struggling to remember even just the names of some of them. Then again, the fact that she even could remember them all at all was impressive, seeing as there had to be thousands of them at this point. There was also the fact that she was currently focused on helping her youngest son train himself quite attentively, from what little she'd gleaned the last few days. All seemingly to help him be properly prepared for his spar with his eldest brother once she deemed him ready to go. Speaking of him, a smile graced her features, as she looked forward towards where said older brother was training in the distance. I know this is a little soon, but perhaps he might have an answer. Wait here, Demeter. I'll be back in a moment, she said, gaining another nod from her second oldest daughter before her body lit up. A golden glow permeating throughout her entire form, before she vanished in an instant from her side, leaving nothing but particles behind. Meanwhile, over with Beerus again, he let out a huff as he stood with his knees bent. Hands balled into fists by his sides as he glared down the stocky dummy that Gia had fashioned for him to help with his next step. One made purely out of clay with remarkably detailed features and imbued with the goddess' divine magic. Remember Beerus, you need to really focus on this. Harnessing the essence of your domain is a tricky thing at first. Gia spoke sagely from several paces behind him. Her arms folded once again under her ginormous breasts and squishing their bountiful flesh up slightly as she watched him with an observant eye. You need to be in true harmony with it to pull it in any way to your will. Don't treat it like it's just some power-up, young one. It's a part of you now, intertwined with your very being. You must not think of yourself as a separate thing to it. That it'll just be something you have sway over, because it isn't. Your thoughts must be that you are synonymous with it. One and the same, for your very existence is tied to the idea of destruction now. You won't simply be a destroyer. You'll be destruction itself given physical form. I'm aware. He called back, having heard her say that not long after they'd begun this particular bit of training. One that sounded oh so simple in theory. All he had to do was pull upon a decent amount of his domain's essence and use it to completely eradicate the dummy, leaving behind not even the tiniest trace of its existence. He'd initially held the rather silly notion that such a thing could be done with just his standard power, given it was above that of anyone else, and he'd smashed his way out of Kronos Castle single-handedly. Something which he'd found out was bound and enforced by the combined power of said Titan and his merry band of morons. Pure arrogance on his part, which Gia had, even to his surprise, crushed rather quickly. All by simply telling him not long after making it, that he was free to test that out if he was so confident. Though he hadn't said it, his impression of his current teacher had shot up quite a good deal once he'd gone to do exactly that. Unlike everything else he'd struck so far in this world, it hadn't just withstood every blow he'd thrown at it. It had done so without so much as budging or even taking a single scratch of damage to his amazement. The dummy's durability had held up easily and unflinchingly, even against his strongest blows. The fact that she could actually conjure up something like this so casually as well, just cemented in his mind even more that she was the best suited to teach him. Getting back to brass tacks though, Beerus closed his eyes as he focused inward. Not simply on the power he'd been naturally born with, but on the essence of destruction now inexorably tied to his being. He breathed in, then out, delving into the deepest recesses of his own soul and attempting to call upon even just a sliver of the divine domain's essence. Once he felt like he had a grasp on it, he threw a hand forward in an eerily familiar way to how he'd done so for his patented Hakai technique back in his previous life, directing it right at the dummy, as he put all his effort into enforcing his will upon it for annihilation. And just like all his other previous attempts thus far, he got absolutely nothing for it. No matter how much he pushed for it. Not even a sliver of his new domain responded to his call, and despite what Gia had told him about the length of time it might take, he still found himself somewhat frustrated at not having even a teensy bit of progress with it. He didn't let it get to him too much though. He'd been told this would be difficult going in, so it would have been stupid to expect this to a breeze. All he could do was just keep trying until he finally got somewhere with it. Just then, a flash of light appeared just behind him, and he instantly felt his new mother's presence there as the light started to dissipate. Ah, Rhea. Gia smiled indulgently. To what do we owe the pleasure? The mother of seven smiled back at her own, though somewhat apologetically. I'm sorry to interrupt whatever training you're currently having him do. By this point, Beerus had turned his head to glance back at her curiously. If you and him wouldn't mind, I'd like to have his assistance for a moment. By all means. I don't mind. Gia acquiesced, before glancing to him. It's up to him though. What say you, Beerus? Care to be a good son and help out your mother? Oh, give over. Beerus just rolled his eyes again, as he turned around fully to meet his mother's gaze. I'm getting nowhere at the minute with this, so I might as well. Who and what's the problem? Is it Hera? No. It's not Hera. Rhea shook her head. She appears to be doing the best so far alongside Hestia, actually. She was. Damn, and here he thought he might end up messing with her for that uppity attitude earlier. Give him some amusement for the day to counterbalance the annoyance he currently felt. It's still early going yet though, and Hades and Poseidon are keeping good pace with them too, so things may just change when we get to the more physical side of things. She added on just so he knew, and as they'd agreed prior to him informing them. I see. Don't mind him, dear daughter. He probably just wants an excuse to go back and flirt with her some more. Gia threw in there playfully. You saw how he was with her a few days ago. Something's bound to happen with those two soon enough at the rate they're going. Beerus's temple creased, eye twitching as he contained his aggravation. Ignore her. It appears she's gone a bit senile in her old age. Mother Earth's eyes narrowed. Ah, I think I struck a nerve there. Someone doesn't like the truth getting out, it seems. You know damn well it's not. Now zip it, woman. Beerus all but ordered, pointing at her accusingly before making a zipping motion with his finger and thumb in case she didn't get the memo. In that moment, he could almost feel Whis giggling along to that remark of hers from dimensions apart, as she let out her own small bout of it at his expense once more. Of all the things she could have had in common with his old master and friend, one of them just had to be a liking for teasing him. Good fucking grief. Getting back on topic now. He said mainly to his mother, as he tuned Gia out. You didn't mention Demeter there, so I'm just gonna assume it's something to do with her. That's right. She nodded, inwardly amused by her own mother's teasing of him. She's struggling to concentrate properly like the others and tap into her power. By her own admission, she appears to have a problem focusing on one thing for very long. Since you've been around her longer than me, I thought you might have an idea how to help her with that. Sure. No problem. He had no clue how to help with that. If he had to choose between that and listening to Gia's insipid teasing right now though, he'd pick the former any day of the week. Take me to her then. I'll see what I can do. Thank you. She reached out and grabbed his shoulder with a motherly smile. I'm sure she'll be happy to see her big brother come to her aid. Yeah. Meanwhile, far out from the Isle of Crete, high up in the heavens themselves, a golden streak flew through the sky at blinding speeds, carving a shining ray of mesmerizing light across where it went. Upon closer inspection, for those whose eyes were capable of perceiving something so impossibly fast, they'd be able to make out a golden chariot being drawn along by several white horses that glowed with the same ethereal aura as the chariot itself. Their eyes glowing with an ominous light inherited from the master that held their reins. This is quite the conundrum we're facing right now, huh? One of the chariot's inhabitants said in a rather cold, matter-of-fact tone, propping an elbow on the vehicle's side and resting the side of their face on their hand, as it whizzed through the sky. It was a woman, and one of stupendously startling beauty with dark hair pulled back into a ponytail reaching the middle of her back, and shockingly pale skin that almost glimmered under the sun's rays. She wore a simple blue and white tunic that hugged her slim, curvaceous figure nicely and only reached down to her knees, where one slender, but shapely leg was hooked over the other. Her lithe arms completely bare, with a small window formed around her chest, exposing some of her ample C-cup cleavage which occasionally jostled about inside her tunic from the movement of the chariot. Her face held a small button nose and full, pinkish lips. Her cheekbones were high and sharp like a razor, with a short and narrow jaw to go with a small chin, followed by a high forehead to rival Hera's and witty-set eyes set a deep, shimmering blue to outdo even the most magnificent of gems. HMPH. You could say that again. The other resident, and the one controlling the chariot's course said in agreement. This was certainly an unexpected turn of events, I must say. That's putting it lightly, Hyperion. The woman replied coolly, eyeing the rapidly passing terrain far below them. I could scarcely believe my ears when I heard of what happened in that throne room with you and our brothers. To think, some uppity new god without a domain to his name would be capable of all that. He's not just an uppity new god, Thea. He's Lord Kronos' own son, and he's incredibly strong for one who is but a fledgling. He made a complete fool of Atlas in his normal state after blowing a hole out of our brother's gut, and then shattered his way out of our abode, taking a chunk of Mount Othries with him. Hyperion stated astutely, whilst sat comfortably in his seat as he surveyed the world below with a critical gaze. His body exuding heavenly light that cascaded all around him and shone like a bright star high above. If he's already capable of that, then I can only imagine what he may be able to do if he was able to ascend like us. Thea, his sister-wife hummed in agreement. Which is exactly why he sent us out first. To find him and the rest of his children long before he can do that. Or they can, for that matter. Nip the problem in the bud as soon as possible. Precisely. The barely clothed Titan turned to her for a moment with a wicked grin. Wherever they're hiding, we'll find them soon enough. And once we do, I'll be sure to personally bring the troublesome brat to Lord Kronos' feet, and end this so-called war he started on us in no time at all. Well, he had actually been ordered by his brother to simply scout out for their whereabouts and then report back to him should he find where they were, so that he could set up the plan to wipe them out with all of them together. Personally, however, Hyperion didn't see a need for such a show of force like that. That level of combined might seem too excessive for what they were currently dealing with. He personally felt he alone was enough to deal with this problem head-on. Thea being with him alone in his mind was already overkill. His grip on the reins tightened as he thought back to that little bastard's arrogant final words to them, all before he and his little group made their exit. The utter gall he'd had to proclaim that he'd not only destroy Kronos, but would also have him, his brothers, and his nephew all groveling at his heels like pathetic dogs. It had been a long time since he'd felt anger like this bubbling up. Not since the days of their father's rule had he felt such vitriol for another. He couldn't wait to find that little shit and show him just how much he'd lucked out the first time. He wasn't going to hold back, not after he'd insulted him and his brothers with that last remark of his. As soon as he saw him, he was going into his true divine form immediately and showing him what real power looked like. Once I wipe the floor with you, I'll savor every moment we get back to Mount Othries and Kronos cuts you to ribbons the same way he did to our father. Mark my words, little man. His eyes lit up with a divine flare as he turned his gaze forward and whipped the reins on his stallions, beckoning them on. Your days are numbered. Even I've never quite seen that before. Well, that was interesting to hear, to say the least. Putting that aside though, she pressed on. Given that is the case, I wouldn't be surprised if when you do find the essence of destruction, for you more than anyone else perhaps, it'll feel like a—
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like this video if you want some more what if video. Comment 3 hearts for more what if.